It's not unusual for Hollywood to return to stories that have proven successful in the past, and one film that has seen itself remade on multiple occasions is A Star is Born. While filmmakers have done plenty of alterations, every version has more or less followed the same story elements. A fading star with a drinking problem comes across a talented young woman who he helps become popular with his connections. They then fall in love and get married, but he continues to fade among the public and succumbs more to alcoholism, eventually leading to an embarrassing incident at an award show. He gets worse and worse until he dies, and his now widow tries to press on and keep his memory alive. What's interesting is that A Star is Born was not the first movie to have this premise. There's a similar film released in 1932 titled What Price Hollywood, directed by George Cukor. This movie, about a director who gives an aspiring actress a chance at movie stardom, uses a lot of the same plot points, although the two lead characters don't get married. A few years later, Cukor was even asked to direct A Star is Born, but he declined due to the similarities between the two scripts. RKO, the studio that produced What Price Hollywood, even considered suing Selznick International Pictures over Star is Born, but decided against it in the end. The original version of A Star is Born was released in 1937 and directed by William A. Wellman, who also received a story credit. The fading actor Norman Maine was played by Frederick March, and the rising star Esker Blodgett was played by Janet Gaynor. As I mentioned, anyone who's seen the later remakes will recognize the plot points in the original film, although there is something this film did that did not carry over to the subsequent versions. The other ones usually begin from the fading star's perspective. In the original, we primarily follow Esther at the start, with Norman not being introduced until later. Those early scenes do the job of making us sympathetic towards her as she faces the difficulties that can come from trying to break into Hollywood. The movie takes a surprisingly critical and dark view of Hollywood during that golden age, as we see Norman being thrown away as his box office decreases, and we also see the lengths the studio goes to transform Esther into her new screen persona of Vicky Lester. I actually watched this A Star is Born last, so it was particularly fascinating to see where many of the now familiar plot points began. The film also serves as an interesting time capsule of Hollywood in the 30s, with many of the city's famous landmarks. We get scenes at the Groundlands Chinese Theater and the Hollywood Bowl, as well as a pivotal moment at the Academy Awards, which were held at the Biltmore Hotel at the time. Regarding the Oscar scene, it might be surprising to modern viewers that it does not depict the tradition of opening the envelope and revealing the winner. The reason is because that practice was not started at the Oscars until a few years after A Star is Born was released. Overall, the original Star is Born was able to mix its Cinderella story with the more tragic elements, with March and Gaynor delivering strong performances. In the 1950s, Sidney Luft decided to produce a remake as a starring vehicle for Judy Garland, who he was married to at the time. This was not her first time playing the role, as she had previously been Esther in a radio adaptation in 1942. George Cukor was asked again if he would be interested in directing A Star is Born, and this time he accepted, as he wanted to direct a musical and work with Garland. Cary Grant was the first choice for Norman Maine, but he turned it down. Humphrey Bogart and Frank Sinatra were also suggested as possibilities. In the end, James Mason agreed to play the role. Released in 1954, the main difference with this version was the addition of several musical numbers. This made sense considering Garland's participation, and we're able to see Esther flourish on the screen and make it understandable why she becomes a big star. These extra musical numbers led to the film running over an hour longer than the original film when it premiered. However, Warner Brothers thought the movie ran too long and cut about 30 minutes from the film for the general release, without Cukor's involvement. During the 1980s, archivists and editors were given permission by Warner to look for the cut footage in their archives, and while some scenes were found, only audio was located for others, and they tried to reconstruct the film as best they could to Cukor's intentions. That's why when you watch A Star is Born nowadays, there are a number of scenes that only display still images with audio, so that's something to keep in mind if you ever decide to watch the film. Despite that, the film still works as an engaging musical, with Garland and Mason both delivering solid work. Despite the added length, the filmmakers did not depart too heavily from the original, with some scenes even sharing a lot of the same dialogue, and Maine's death scene playing out in a similar manner. The film does not reinvent the wheel, but as a Golden Age musical, it does its job of giving the audience some solid song numbers and becomes a strong showcase for Garland. In the 70s, it was decided to revisit the material again, but change the setting from the film industry to music. Barbra Streisand played Esther this time, and she would also serve as the executive producer. This was also the first movie produced by John Peters, Streisand's former hairdresser, who she was dating at the time. He would later become a producer or executive producer on films like Caddyshack, Clue, The Witches of Eastwick, Rain Man, and Tim Burton's Batman, and also had a short stint running Sony Pictures. However, he's probably most well known today for being the subject of a classic Kevin Smith story about his time producing a Superman movie that never happened.
1, I don't want to see him in that suit. 2, I don't want to see him fly. And 3, he's got to fight a giant spider in the third act.
The name of the fading star was altered to John Norman Howard, and Elvis Presley was the first person off the role. However, his manager, Tom Parker, intervened and asked for too much money, also not wanting him to portray someone whose popularity was in decline. Neil Diamond was also considered, but he had other commitments. Chris Christopherson eventually got it. Frank Pearson directed the film, but he reportedly had a lot of creative disagreements with Streisand and did not look back fondly on his time making it. When this version of A Star is Born was released in 1976, it was a big hit, but critics were less than enthusiastic, and I personally agree with their assessment of the film. The biggest problem I have with the movie is it mostly comes across like a vanity project for Barbra Streisand. She also shares little chemistry with Christopherson, and I never got the impression these two characters were in love. These are two pretty unlikable characters, and that makes it hard to get invested in their respective rise and fall. The film meanders along, the story feeling misshapen, which is surprising seeing as it had two previous movies to work off from. When the big tragedy with Howard happens in the third act, it's hard to feel much of anything. One of the few bright spots of the film comes from Gary Busey as Howard's manager, as he provides an entertaining performance. Some of the song sequences are also okay, but I otherwise found this remake to be a dull affair. Even though this Star is Born runs about 35 minutes shorter than the '54 remake, it feels so much longer. It would take 42 years for another remake of A Star is Born to be produced, but not for lack of trying. Directors like Carl Franklin and Oliver Stone showed interest in directing one, while Jamie Foxx, Will Smith, Mariah Carey, and Lauryn Hill had come close to starring. Clint Eastwood almost got one off the ground with Bradley Cooper and Beyoncé signed on to play the lead roles, but Beyoncé then dropped out, and that put the remake on hold. Eventually, Cooper stepped up to make his directorial debut, and even though he originally wanted to find someone else to play the lead role, he then changed his mind. Lady Gaga was then chosen to be his co-star. Curiously, the decision was made to remake the 1976 film rather than the earlier Hollywood set versions. With this new film being directed, written, and produced by its lead actor, and featuring one of the biggest pop stars in the world, it could have fallen into the same trap as the '70s Star is Born and become a vanity project. Impressively, Cooper avoided that completely. He and Gaga exhibited solid chemistry with one another, and something this remake did differently from the previous films was put an emphasis on family. The alcoholic singer, here named Jackson Maine, has an older brother in this version who also serves as his manager, and we see how his behavior affects their relationship. One of the aspects 2018's A Star is Born was acclaimed for was the music. The songs were well woven into the narrative, with the main theme Shallow serving as the centerpiece. This song became a massive hit, and for understandable reasons, as it's a memorable tune, and both Bradley Cooper and Lady Gaga pour their hearts into it. Beyond that, the movie does not venture too far off the beaten path from the Star is Born formula, but can you blame the filmmakers? If this is a storyline that has impressed audiences since 1937, you're not exactly going to alter it too much. I did think it ran just a little too long, although maybe that was my fault for already being very familiar with the story at this point. It is easy to see why this became a massive hit beyond fans of the popular singer headlining the film, and proved to be another well-done retelling. And I'm sure it won't be the last time either, as 30 or 40 years from now, we will likely see another Star is Born reach screens. Audiences of new generations seem to really respond to this story, both for the inspiring rise of a young woman reaching her dreams, and the emotional tragedy that eventually occurs to the person who saw her potential. And that's why Hollywood keeps coming back to it. Which version of A Star is Born do I prefer? I'm actually going to pick the original from 1937. I think it's the best written, able to tell the story in a concise manner without losing the necessary beats that make us invest in lead characters, and I like that we spend more time with Esther at the beginning. However, which do you think is the best iteration? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.